Will you please pray with me? God, we ask that it is you we hear and feel in these words and in this place. Amen. Everyone's going to need to go ahead and grab a Bible, or at least I would prefer that you do. And we're going to be looking at the very beginning of the book of Job and the very end of the book of Job. So if you end up grabbing a pew Bible, I'll be able to tell you what pages. But first, you're going to want to go ahead and just turn to page 392 if you're using a pew Bible. Otherwise, just go to Job chapter 1. But don't look at it yet. It's like a test that's ready. I'm going to ask you a question. I don't want you to cheat. Do you all remember how we were introduced to the character of Job? Does anybody recall how he was first introduced in this book? Well, then it's good that we're reviewing it. So we're going to go to Job chapter 1. Way back in the very first chapter of this book, the first 5 verses introduce us to the character of Job. We're going to read those again. And it says, in the Pew Bible, it's 392. It says, "There once was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go out and hold feasts in one another's houses in turn, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the feast days had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, 'It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts.' This is what Job always did." That's our introduction to the character of Job. What does this tell us about Job? He was wealthy. What else? Pleased God. The first thing it tells us when it starts off, there once was a man named in the land of Uz whose name was Job, is that it's a literary device, right? Job is representing something more than just a single person. And as we move through the book, we saw how Job represents all of us. Job represents humanity and humanity's relationship with God, specifically people who say they're faithful in God. It also tells us that then, as in now, we define people as being good based on material possessions, based on how much stuff they have, right? It's really easy for us to fall into that trap to see somebody with all the nicest things and think, oh boy, they must be really good people. God must have blessed them because they have material things. But as we move through this book, we saw how God does not correlate material goods with being faithful or blessed. We specifically saw that in the last couple of chapters with God and the whirlwind. These verses also show us that Job wishes he could control his children. How many people have had that feeling? Every person who's ever had a kid, or babysat, or been around children for any length of time, right? He wishes that he could have control of his children. He disagrees with their lifestyle, and he goes to God seeking forgiveness and control over their sanctification, control over them being right with God. Job desires to change the ways of his children. We get all of that in just those 5 verses. As we read through the book, or as we read through the book, we saw again and again where a big part of Job's grief is actually over losing control. He loses control of his wealth. He loses control of his family. He loses control of his health. And he gets very upset about that loss, as many of us would, which is why Job is representative of all of us. And we've all heard people say, or maybe we've said it ourselves about someone else when they say something like, "I just don't know how they do it. I could never live like that. I don't know if I could get around that way. Maybe it'd be better to be dead than to live like that." Well, we saw how in the midst of all of his pain and troubles, the people around Job told him he would be better off dead. That they would rather be dead than to deal with being that out of control of their own life. We saw Job turn to God and curse the day he was born. He says, it's better that I not live, that I had never been born, than to have had all of these things and have them taken away from me. It's better that I had not been born than to not be in control. I heard a story about a family with 2 horses, and from a distance, each horse looks just like any other horse. But if you stop your car or if you're walking slowly by, you'll notice something quite amazing about these 2 horses. Looking into the eyes of the one horse will tell you very quickly that that horse is blind. It can't see at all. And his owner has chosen not to have him put down, but has made a good home for him. And if you're nearby and wait long enough, you'll start to hear the sound of a bell. If you look around for the source of that bell, you'll see that it's attached to the harness on the other horse. It lets her blind friend know where she is in the field so that he can follow her. If you stand long enough and you watch these 2 friends, you'll see how she is always checking on him, and that he will listen for her bell and then slowly walk to wherever it is she is, trusting that she will not lead him astray. And when she returns to the barn every evening, she stops occasionally and will look back to make sure he can hear the bell and is not far behind. There is beauty in life, even in a life that we might not understand. That is what God in the whirlwind shows Job. That's what we spent the last 2 weeks discovering. That there's this new vision that God gives to all of us. And now Job decides, after seeing creation from a God's eye perspective, Job decides to continue with life. He could continue to curse the day he was born and say, just take my life from me, but he doesn't. He recants. He says, I was wrong, God. I thought it was all about me, but now I see that this isn't about me. It's about something much greater. Creation is so much larger than just me. He decides he no longer wishes to be blind to the beauty of God's creation and wants God to lead him. He relinquishes some control. At the end of Job, we read about the life Job has after his ordeal. And we're going to turn, if you're using a Pew Bible, it's on page 424. It's chapter 42. And we're going to start at verse 10. Actually, verse 12. Chapter 42. It says, the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, and he had 14,000 sheep and 6,000 camels and 1,000 yoke of oxen and 1,000 donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he named the first Jemima, the second Keziah, and the third Karen-Happuch. In all the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an inheritance along with their brothers. After this, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and his children's children 4 generations. And Job died old and full of days. The introduction to Job and what we're left with are pretty similar, right? Catherine Schifferdecker analyzes this last chapter really well when she writes, in the last chapter of the book of Job, Job is commended by God for speaking to God. If you recall, when we went through all those speeches, all of Job's friends talk about God, and Job goes through a time where he talks about God, but he finally turns and talks to God. And Job commends him for that. Because unlike his friends, he's continued to speak to God, and he's been faithful to that relationship. So Job's fortunes are restored, and he and presumably his wife, Mrs. Job, have more children. And he gives his daughters names befitting their great beauty and an inheritance along with their brothers, which is an unheard of act in that patriarchal culture. It's important that we see that he gave each of them an inheritance equal to the brothers. In other words, Job learns to govern his world the way God governs God's world, with great delight in his children's beauty and freedom. Like God, Job gives his children the freedom to be who they were created to be. He's changed. And the question we must ask is not how much or how little does it cost God to give more children, but what does it cost Job to become a father again? He's already lost his kids. He's gone through the pain of all their deaths. And yet he's decided, knowing what could potentially happen, he is deciding he chooses to have more children. Job chooses to live again, even though he knows all too well the pain, the suffering that living and loving entails. Such a choice stems from his fierce faith in a God of life. J.W. Bray Jr. wrote in Guideposts, the magazine, hosting a TV show, I've interviewed my share of beauty contestant winners. I once even had Miss America on my show. But when a friend asked if I would judge a beauty contest at a nursing home, I thought, good heavens, what on earth would be the criteria for judging? When I arrived at Wooddale Nursing Home, I saw a list of the 8 contestants and their ages from 85 to 92. This isn't going to be easy, I thought. One woman wore a flowing blue satin dress, others had done up their hair in elaborate coifs, and some had spots of color on their cheeks, and they walked past the judges, some more gracefully than others, happily waving at the audience. When the contestants reached the MC, he asked each one of them in turn, what was the most important day of your life? The day I got married, one woman declared. When my son was born, another responded. I just celebrated my 50th wedding anniversary, said a third. How will I ever be able to choose, I wondered. Then 88-year-old Sybil sashayed up to the microphone, and when I heard her answer to the question, I knew we had a winner. Why, today, of course, she said, smiling. Always today. The other judges agreed. When we placed the gold crown on her head, everyone in the audience whistled and cheered. It's that kind of attitude that makes for beauty at any age. What's the most important day of your life? Today. Always today. Job lets go and decides to live knowing he won't be in control. Knowing it's impossible for him to control everything around him, to put safeguards in place where he won't feel that pain and that suffering, to put safeguards in place where his children won't have to feel that pain and that suffering that comes with life. He decides that life is worth living, that every day, even the seemingly bad ones, are a gift from God. We must make the choice too. We have to choose how we will live. Christ tells us, as we heard in the gospel today, I came that they might have life and have it abundantly. Abundant life. How can we have abundant life if we're constantly living in fear of pain or suffering? If we're too afraid to love because we don't want to feel the pain of not loving anymore? If we're too afraid to invite people in because we don't want to feel the pain of what it's like when they're gone? If we're too afraid to try new ministries because we don't want to feel the pain of what it's like when we fail? How is that life abundant? Catherine writes at the end of the book of Job, it must be acknowledged that there is no fully satisfactory answer to the problem of innocent suffering. That's what we all look for in that book, but there's no answer to that. But still, Job provides us several faithful responses to suffering. Speaking to God honestly and directly. Trusting that God will answer. Risking living and loving even after great pain. and delighting in a world that is wild and beautiful and risky, trusting in the faithful God who created and still sustains the world. We must choose if we will live in this life of beauty of creation, knowing that pain and suffering are a part of it, or if we will live in fear. Job chooses to live again because he loves God. And do we love God because of what we get from the relationship, or do we love God for who God is? That was our big question all the way back from chapter 1. And I hope maybe we're at a place where we can answer it. In the end, Job leaves it all up to God and chooses to live even in the depths of his despair. He loves God for who God is. But I don't know what the answer is for all of you. Do you love God for what you get out of a relationship? Or do you love God for who God is?